Good morning. Those were really, really good papers, and I'm really glad that we got to hear some of that stuff because it's quite different from what I'm working on. So it's, you start to work and you're in your own headspace and you don't necessarily get to see what everybody else is doing. So it's really exciting to see what's going on here. I'm going to change the focus a bit, and I'm going to get a little bit anthropological. And we're going to talk about mortuary spaces, ethics, and how the antiquities market come together in games. So for today's purpose, I'm going to be specifically looking at case studies from Dragon Age Inquisition, so that I don't have to say Dragon Age Inquisition over and over again for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to call it DAI, because if you've ever had to say Dragon Age Inquisition 30 times in a row, after a while you're just like, tongues. So it's my hope, though, that even though I'm looking specifically at DAI, by the end of this, you're going to see that there's some larger concepts that can apply to lots of games, and that when you go and you play something else, you're going to find that the same things are happening all over the place. I also want to note, because I think this is important for some people, especially with long games like DAI, that this talk is not spoilery for the main narrative of the game. So if you haven't played yet, or if you haven't finished, because this game can be in the hundreds of hours long, you're not actually going to get ruined on anything by this talk. So within games in general, within fantasy role-playing games specifically, mortuary environments, they perform very specific roles. At their most basic, they give you a venue for exposition dump. They give you a lot of historic information. They give you world-building information. But that information is all presented to you in a very optional way. As a player, you can choose to accept or reject as much of the information as you want to get. And it allows the developer to flesh out the world for the people who really want lots of backstory and lots of detail, and not alienate the players who don't necessarily want to read, the entire history of the Empire. And I think probably if we polled hands in here, those of you who play games, you know which camp you're in. You know if you're the people who read every single monument, or you know if you're the people who are like main narrative, pushing through, want to find out what happens. Can I get hands? How many people you read everything in a game? Oh my God, you're my people. I've never been in a room with so many of my people. Yeah, I read everything. I'm like the only person who reads all the quest text on everything. So the second thing that mortuary spaces provide is a venue for integrating religious traditions within games. Often these religious traditions are expressed materially through monument placement, through inscription text, or through a lack of inscription text, which can be very telling. You can see it in whether the site is abandoned or maintained, and you can see it through allusions to real-world peoples, which create a sort of visual shorthand for culture. In a game like DII, this is going to let the player infer a lot about cultural groups, racial groups within the world. It allows you to mentally situate yourself so that you know how you fit in the game into common cultural tropes and fantasy settings. And it also allows you to take those tropes and sort of apply them to your reality of multiculturalism within what Andrew would call meat space. So this brings us to the idea of micro-narratives of culture, which is the concept within a game world. There are layers of narrative. There's the overarching narrative. That's what is going to be your plot. There's the character arc specific narrative, which is where you see character growth and change. There's the narrative that creates the world space, which is really the conceptual idea for the world and how it's bounded and how it's delivered for our understanding as players. And there's an individual narrative within that space, which is narratives that tell particular stories, isolated, that as an aggregate are important for bringing the world together. Micro-narratives are stories that have a whole narrative arc, but it's contained within a tiny little sliver of something. They're often presented on artifacts or on monuments. So micro-narratives of culture, when we apply it to a cultural standpoint, these are those stories, but they contain all the defining characteristics or all the defining cultural aspects of a culture. So they're material culture sort of as concrete contained vehicles for larger cultural expression. And what you have here is part of a micro-narrative as presented on one weapon in Dragon Age, which is actually quite a good weapon. So if you can get this one, look it up. It's really easy to get. It's nice. So there's two micro-narratives of culture that are in mortuary spaces that I want to look at today. The first is the Vallisdalen, which is located in the Emerald Graves area. You're going to encounter the Vallisdalen as part of an optional area and collection quest for Emerald Graves. And if you think about the zone name Emerald Graves, it's kind of on the nose. You get a sense of like what the developers are trying to give you here in this area. Each Vallisdalen, as you see here, is actually the tree. So the tree is the Vallisdalen, and it represents a person's life. And each tree is marked with a stone monument. And the monument tells the life story of a particular elf, and then the whole group of them together tell the stories of the heroes of this fallen elven empire. And something that really is what made me start thinking about this is these monuments in this quest, they're very interesting in how historical memory is commodified and how historical memory is privileged. Each of the Vallisdalen monuments tells this tiny encapsulating life's history. Each one could stand on its own. You put together and you get the story of a fall of a people, and it's a very personal, potentially poignant method of storytelling. It's memory, it's memorial, it's history, it's loss. It can be very, very beautiful. And I found it very interesting, and it's what me got me thinking about micro-narratives in mortuary space. And so you've got all of this, and that's all great. But this potentially personal, poignant story is overlaid by how the mechanics of the game actually value collection and consumption over experiential participation. Instead of making this an exploration of experience that you assign your own value to as a player, the game makes it an acquisition quest. And you find all the trees, you get a prize, and on top of that, for each one that you find, you stick a banner representing your conquest in front of the memorial. So you sort of subsume the historical past of an othered culture through your role as a colonizer and as a conqueror. It actually, like, playing the game through the first time, you know, you're very excited. You're like, yeah, I'm finding everything. This is great. But when you start to go back and think about the ethics of it, and I had to go back to like previous save games to be able to get all the pictures for all the states, it made me feel very uncomfortable with the ethic that the game was pushing as a colonizer, and that the only real role of these monuments is for you now to find them. And it didn't entirely make sense to me that this quest should be incentivized through a monetary reward mechanic. That's something that I was thinking about a lot. There's no narrative reason for asking a player to seek out and claim each and every mortuary monument. There's no callback in the larger story to these monuments. There's no reason behind acquiring the locations. In a game that has literally hundreds of hours of potential gameplay, why would you have this sort of optional content, which should be everywhere? It should be filling the world with all of this sort of content. Why does that world need to be called out via commodification? Why is that the mechanic that we choose to use for it? It's essentially gamification for the sake of gamification, and in the larger picture, it felt very off. So your second micro-narrative is the Tomb of Pharaoh. It's a culmination of a series of interactions that are all essentially structured the same way, but they come together in one big final example. So this is much more what players of fantasy role-playing games are used to seeing in terms of a quest progression. You explore 5 tombs. The game frames as rumors tell of a grand treasure buried in a tomb in the hissing waste. Explore the waste using any available clues and maps to find it. So they immediately put you into a frame where your goal here is to find this thing and take stuff from it. They don't even hide it at all. You go to each of these tombs, you manipulate a puzzle that requires you to take fragments of verse and order them into a coherent narrative. And then when you do that, they allow you to loot something from the tomb, and they give you a key piece, which goes to the larger tomb. So you go from tomb to tomb, collecting this stuff, looking for the big one. the way that the micronarrative comes together is less individual, less personal than the Valis-Stalin narrative. It's still a technical micronarrative of culture. It's still entirely self-contained. It's still entirely optional storytelling. And you can, at each tomb, decide not to take the object that they offer you as loot. So you have that ethical choice. You can choose not to loot. But if you don't take the keys, which the overarching puzzle and the overarching narrative make very clear to you were purposefully deposited grave goods, then you cannot complete the narrative of the quest. You take these tiny bits of narrative and you're never going to get any narrative resolution because you don't take the keys, you don't get it. So it could have stood on its own as an experience, but it was commodified. The goal becomes exploring each tomb to engage in looting, which the historic background only then serves as a means to justify collection and hoarding and resale. Which brings us around to the third use of mortuary space that I mentioned earlier, and the primary reason for inclusion of mortuary spaces in games. Mortuary spaces in games, sites of religious and cultural veneration, they exist as the ultimate culmination of an ethical position assumed in games that history is background, that cultural patrimony has no authority, and that artifacts and past people belong to all peoples of the present, and thus can be redistributed according to modern market values. Through DAI, you're encouraged as a player to take objects from the recent dead. You're encouraged to take objects that are abandoned in chests. We might sometime talk about if all these things are abandoned in chests, why did they lock them up? When I lock something up, I'm not abandoning it. I'm just leaving it somewhere. That's fine, that's something else. And then you resale all these objects to get what you actually want, to get the good sword, to get the good armor, to repair your fortress, whatever you want to do. The ethical position assumed here is that possession equals entitlement to disposition, and that it's reinforced in choice after choice, encounter after encounter. So by the time the player is presented with a mortuary space, the game has taken this encouragement to make leap after leap and taken it from where taking a purposefully interred object doesn't seem that different from what you've been doing in the rest of the game. And that's a really problematic choice that the game tries to make you feel is not problematic. It tries to make you feel that that's just the normal progression of things. It is problematic though, because it undermines the impact that narratives such as these micro-narratives can have on the importance of recognizing and valuing the cultures and the historic pasts of other people. It turns these pasts from understandable others into resources that can be exploited for personal gain, and it ultimately devalues the past once the commercial potential has been exhausted. So there are parallels between this ethical position and our treatment of artifacts as saleable antiquities within our own economic and value systems. And the thing is that DAI actually knows this and explicitly confronts it, which is why this game is interesting to me, because they know what they're doing, but they still keep doing it. So you get to this area, Bar Balinaris. Once again, you have a bunch of tombs, you have a locked door, you have to find the key in order to get into the tombs. But unlike in the rest of the game, the area here actually draws an explicit connection between the fact that you're looting these tombs and that there is a modern descendant community that is related to these tombs. And this is the only place in the game where if you dig up the tombs, you actually suffer a penalty with someone else in the game. It makes it more difficult to complete other progressions in the game because the people who are the descendant community don't really like the fact that you're going in here and pulling all this stuff up. Nowhere else in the entire game is this referenced as an issue. Even though that same descendant community is throughout the game, and you do this in other places with their mortuary spaces, there's only one section of the game where they actually, it's like they get this moment of self-awareness, and they're like, oh, hey, this stuff might actually still belong to someone, it might still be important, we're gonna make you think about it, and then no, don't ever think about it again. So I'm trying to put together why the relationship between ethics, mortuary spaces, and looting are framed this way. These are the key questions I've looked at. Why does the game advance an ethical position that it acknowledges as inappropriate? How could the systems in the game be modified in order to allow for an ethic that is not an ethic of commodification, it's not an ethic of consumption, it's not an ethic of the Western view of artifacts as saleable objects? Would the narrative of this game actually be impacted if you removed these looting situations from the game? And finally, why is exploitation of cultural resources the default when we play these games? Why is it when every game that you think about, if you think that there are cultures and artifacts in it, why is this automatically what we go to? It's to take it and to sell it. These are the things that I've been thinking about. I think it's possible to formulate particular answers to these questions for DAI. I think that for a lot of games it's possible to find specific questions for why it's done in that game. But we need to be looking at the bigger picture and consider how archaeological ethics are occurring in industry-wide context. We have this huge industry making these games. We have this huge population of players who we could technically be reaching with historical information, with archaeological information, with multicultural information. But until we understand why it is that this is what everyone wants to consume, we can't really have a meaningful discourse on cultural heritage until we understand the drivers that are presenting it. So, that's my work over the next 3 years. So I'll get back to you in 3 years if I have an answer to these questions. So I want to thank my advisors. I want to thank everyone who came today, and I really want to thank the organizers, because like I said at the beginning, this is so great to be able to have this group of people together to actually talk about this stuff instead of all of us just like having these tiny conversations on Twitter. So thank you very much.
Right away, let's see the best way I can get there. We see this looting culture in games all over the place. I mean, it's unheard. Loot this, loot that, and it's all over. Do you think that there's been an impact in the real world as far as perception of what is socially acceptable in loot space for the looting of artifacts and material culture via playing?
Welcome to part 3 of my dissertation, which is, that's actually one of the big things I'm going to be looking at is, does the participation in looting through things like games like this, does it actually create a permissive attitude in people that makes it seem more acceptable to perform those actions in the real world? Is there a correlation between playing a game and your attitudes on how artifacts should be valued versus how you value them in meat space? So we'll talk about it. I'm working on it. I think yes. Spoiler alert, I think yes.
You were saying that these looting over and over again, find the key, open the grave.
Yes.
That is what the players want. Is it really what the players want, or is it the only thing that's been fed to them?
I don't think it's what necessarily always what the players want, but I think it's the system that's being delivered, and I think because of the repetition of it, that's what creates that breakdown and that devaluing, so that when you go from the actions of taking from somebody you just killed, which is like a whole other problematic thing, but taken from chests, taken from all that stuff, that suddenly you're like, oh, this is clearly someone's tomb and their name is on it. I'm going to open it up and I'm going to take all the stuff. That doesn't create any sort of dissonance in your mind, like, if I was walking down the street and I saw a cemetery, I would not just go and start digging something up. I hope. If you do, don't tell me, because I feel like I have a legal responsibility for it.
Is it possible, in Oblivion there was a trail whereby you were supposed to assassinate people and they got more and more good.
Yes.
So I never finished that.
No, I had to stop on the last one. Like there was one where you had to kill somebody's dog or somebody's kid, and I was just like,
You'll be happy in England then. My question for you is it possible that the more you lose, the more your character becomes haunted by your enemy seeker?
I would like that. I think that would be an interesting mechanic to implement. I think, if you're going to force a mechanic that requires looting, I think it would be a good situation to also enforce a system that made you confront that choice. That's really what I want to say, yeah.
Thank you.
I just had one question.
Sure.
I was wondering, these micro-narratives that were represented through mortuary spaces,
Yeah.
don't you think that is a problem as well? Because they only represent themselves in artifacts of the dead, and
Yeah.
there are different ways of doing it.
Yeah, I think it is. I think it often is a real easy, functional way to get the information across that doesn't necessarily reflect how we view historical memory in the real world. I think that we have such nuanced, complex ideas about how we process the past and how we process mortuary space that it's very easy to stick it on a thing, stick it on a monument, and make that be the delivery mechanism. And I think until we get to a state of games where we can represent more of the nuance than we have, I think it's the best system we have, but it's not the system. I'm an idealist. I want it all to be better. I want games to be better. I want ethics to be better. I want it all to be better. So yeah.
We in fact have a question from our Twitch chat.
Oh no. Okay.
Yes, we're a blended
It's not my
audience.
advisor, is it?
How could these games incorporate and immerse mortuary practices? I guess that's what practices is what I am adding here. In the game to create a more rewarding or interactive experience with the players that would help them understand the mortuary archaeology more.
That's a good question.
There you go, yeah. That's the power of the internet.
Thanks Twitch, thanks Internet. I answered all the questions if everybody was here. Now you're gonna make me look silly. So I think that if there were more narratives that require you to engage with the space and to understand the space instead of just to temporarily walk into the space, take something from it, and then depart. If you had a situation where the space really was given value, both narrative value, game value, and value to you as a player and as a player character, then I think we might engage better with those spaces. But as it is right now, like I said, they're basically a spot to go to, and they're a very popular spot to go to.
Thanks, man. We're not paying her to mention her name very often, by the way.